A doe rabbit can turn a pound of hay and garden scraps into meat more efficiently than almost any farmed mammal alive. She can conceive again within a day of giving birth. A single female can produce upward of 10 litters a year. Each litter can be ready for the table in roughly 2 months. No cow, pig, or sheep raised for meat comes anywhere close to that reproductive turnover. And yet, here is the part that genuinely does not track. Rabbit meat is leaner than chicken, lower in cholesterol than beef, and dramatically cheaper to produce than nearly anything else in a grocery store meat case. So, why can you not actually buy it at a grocery store meat case in most of the United States? And why does the entire idea of eating one still make most Americans a little uneasy? This channel builds one investigation like this every week, and this one turns out to be less about cartoons than about a very specific gap in federal law. Start with the raw efficiency, because the numbers really are striking. A doe converts feed into body weight at a ratio that outperforms cattle by a wide margin, since almost none of her energy gets diverted into carrying hundreds of pounds of frame the way a growing calf does. She needs a fraction of the water a cow requires, can be raised in a small hutch rather than acres of pasture, and reaches market weight while a beef calf is still, quite literally, nowhere near ready for slaughter. Agricultural researchers comparing feed conversion efficiency across common livestock species generally rank rabbit favorably against poultry and considerably ahead of cattle, a ranking that has held up consistently across decades of extension research without ever translating into meaningful commercial adoption anywhere in the American food system. On paper, in a world increasingly worried about land use, water scarcity, and feed efficiency, rabbit should be one of the most attractive proteins available. That efficiency case has been sitting in agricultural literature for generations, largely unchallenged and largely ignored. The nutritional case sits right alongside the environmental one and rarely gets discussed with it. Rabbit meat consistently tests as one of the leanest common proteins available, carrying a higher proportion of protein relative to fat than chicken breast and a meaningfully lower cholesterol content than most cuts of beef or pork. None of that is a new discovery dressed up for a modern audience. Agricultural extension services and nutrition researchers have documented rabbit's favorable protein to fat ratio for decades, consistently enough that the basic nutritional case has never really been the obstacle here. A food that is simultaneously cheap to produce, gentle on land and water, and nutritionally competitive with or better than the meats already dominating the American diet should, by any purely rational accounting, have a real foothold in the market. It essentially does not, and the nutrition numbers alone have never been enough to explain why. The part almost nobody brings into this conversation is that rabbit meat occupies a genuinely strange legal category in the United States, one that has nothing to do with taste or squeamishness at all. Beef, pork, and chicken all fall under federal laws, specifically the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Poultry Products Inspection Act, that make continuous government inspection legally mandatory before that meat can cross state lines or reach a grocery shelf. Rabbit does not fall under either law. Congress simply never included it. As a result, rabbit meat inspection in the United States is classified as voluntary, available to producers who choose to pay for it, but not required the way it is for essentially every other major meat sold commercially. Regulatory authority over rabbit defaults instead to the Food and Drug Administration, which treats it as what the relevant federal rule literally labels a non-amenable species, a category shared with animals like bison and venison, rather than with chicken or beef. The origin of that gap is almost entirely administrative rather than deliberate. When the core federal meat inspection framework was assembled and later expanded across the 20th century, lawmakers built the mandatory inspection system around the handful of species that already dominated American commercial meat production at the time: cattle, hogs, sheep, and eventually poultry, as that industry grew large enough to warrant its own dedicated law. Rabbit was never a significant enough commercial category at the moment those laws were written to earn a place inside them, and once the legal framework was set, expanding it to formally include a new species required an act of Congress rather than a simple regulatory adjustment. Decades later, agricultural policy researchers and food law scholars examining this exact gap have specifically flagged it as a structural oversight, rather than any considered judgment about rabbit meat itself, an accident of legislative timing that simply never got revisited once industrial-scale rabbit production failed to develop enough political weight to force the issue. That distinction sounds bureaucratic, and it is, but it produces real, practical consequences that ripple all the way down to why a supermarket chain stocks or does not stock a product. Large grocery distributors operate on strict, standardized supply chains built entirely around mandatory federal inspection, since that inspection is what allows a product to move across state lines with predictable legal protection and consistent safety guarantees. A meat that only carries voluntary inspection, inspected inconsistently depending on which individual processor chose to pay for the service, does not slot cleanly into that system. Liability exposure increases. Sourcing becomes unpredictable from supplier to supplier. For a major retailer optimizing an entire meat department around uniform, federally guaranteed inspection, rabbit becomes a genuinely awkward category to build a reliable supply chain around, regardless of how the meat tastes or how efficiently it was raised. Retail buyers responsible for stocking a grocery chain's meat case also work under strict internal risk management policies that generally favor products carrying the strongest, most consistent regulatory backing available, since a recall or contamination event involving an inconsistently inspected product carries outsized reputational and legal risk for the retailer, not just the producer. A category built on voluntary inspection, where one processor might participate and a nearby processor might not, makes it considerably harder for a national chain to guarantee the same safety standard across every store in its network. That is not a judgment about rabbit meat's actual safety, which can be entirely sound under voluntary inspection. It is a judgment about institutional risk tolerance, and large retailers have consistently chosen the path of least regulatory ambiguity, which rabbit, structurally, has never been able to offer them. It is worth sitting for a moment with what that regulatory gap actually means for the people trying to raise and sell rabbit today, since the effect is not abstract. A small producer who wants to sell rabbit meat commercially in most states faces a meaningfully steeper, more expensive path to market than a producer raising chickens, since chicken automatically qualifies for the federal inspection infrastructure that already exists at scale, while a rabbit producer has to actively seek out and often pay extra for a voluntary inspection service that many processing facilities are not even set up to offer. Multiply that friction across an entire industry, and you get exactly what currently exists: a scattered network of small, local rabbit producers selling directly to individual customers or specialty restaurants, essentially locked out of the national supply chain infrastructure that turned chicken into a fixture of every supermarket in the country. Whatever advantage rabbit holds on paper simply evaporates somewhere between the farm gate and the loading dock. The efficiency of the animal itself was never the bottleneck. The plumbing connecting farm to shelf simply was never built for it, and nobody in Washington ever passed the law that would have required it to be. Consider what that actually looks like for a specific, ordinary, small producer today. A farmer raising both chickens and rabbits on the same modest plot of land can generally send chickens to a nearby USDA-inspected poultry processor without much friction, since that infrastructure already exists in most agricultural regions, specifically because federal law requires it to. That same farmer trying to process rabbits commercially often has to search out one of a much smaller number of facilities willing to offer voluntary inspection, sometimes driving considerably farther, sometimes paying a meaningfully higher per animal processing fee, simply because the volume of rabbit business flowing through that facility is so much smaller than the volume of poultry business subsidizing its existence. The math that looked so favorable for rabbit back at the level of feed conversion and reproduction rates quietly reverses once processing and market access enter the picture, not because the animal became less efficient, but because the surrounding system was never built to carry it at scale. There is a popular historical story people sometimes reach for to explain how humans first started raising rabbits at all, and it is worth addressing directly because it turns out to be false in an interesting way. For years, a widely repeated legend held that a pope in the early medieval period officially declared unborn rabbit fetuses to count as fish rather than meat, making them acceptable food during Lent, and that French monks, eager for a permitted source of rich food during fasting season, began deliberately breeding rabbits in captivity as a result. Researchers conducting a detailed genetic and historical investigation into rabbit domestication traced that story back to its actual origin and found the entire premise does not hold up. No such papal declaration exists anywhere in the historical record. The confusion traces back to a mix up between two different historical figures who happen to share the same name, and the original medieval document actually being referenced describes someone condemning the practice of eating young rabbits during a religious fast, not endorsing it. The tidy, popular version of Rabbit's origin story as a loophole for hungry monks turns out to be a myth built on a citation error repeated for generations before anyone traced it back far enough to catch the mistake. What genetic evidence from the same research does support is a slower, messier, far less romantic domestication process unfolding gradually across multiple regions without any single decree or single moment anyone can point to. It is worth understanding exactly how a citation error like that manages to survive for so long, since the mechanism says something useful about how historical myths in general tend to calcify. The researchers who traced the story found that a genuine 7th century document, written by a different historical figure entirely, a bishop and chronicler rather than a pope, really did mention someone eating young rabbits during a period of religious fasting. Later writers, working centuries afterward and apparently confusing two men who happened to share the same name, transformed a passing, disapproving mention into an entirely invented papal ruling, then repeated that invented ruling confidently enough across enough subsequent books and articles that it eventually hardened into settled fact almost nobody thought to double check. The lesson embedded in that error is not really about rabbits specifically. It is about how a single, misattributed source, copied forward without anyone tracing it back to the original document, can outlive its own inaccuracy for the better part of a millennium. Setting that specific legend aside, it remains true that rabbit farming had a real, documented moment of mainstream acceptance in parts of the English-speaking world during periods of wartime meat scarcity, when household rabbit raising was actively promoted as a practical way to supplement ration diets. That history is real, and it establishes clearly that cultural resistance to eating rabbit is not some fixed, universal human trait. It is a preference that has shifted before, under the right pressure, and shifted back again once that pressure eased. What is worth noting, though, is what did not accompany that wartime shift: a corresponding change to the underlying regulatory and processing infrastructure. Rabbit became temporarily common at the dinner table because household backyard raising required none of the federal inspection apparatus a national supply chain would have needed, which meant that once the wartime pressure lifted, and that grassroots, backyard system stopped being necessary, there was no leftover industrial foundation left standing the way there was for chicken. The cultural memory faded because the infrastructure behind it was never built to outlast the emergency that created it in the first place. Understanding why it shifted back and stayed that way for decades, requires looking past cartoons and toward a specific area of psychological research. Most casual explanations skip entirely. Researchers studying how people mentally reconcile caring about animals while also eating them have documented something more precise than a simple sentimental attachment to any one species. Multiple controlled studies have found that the act of categorizing an animal as food or actually consuming meat from a specific animal causally reduces how much mental capacity, awareness, emotion, the ability to suffer people attribute to that same animal afterward. In one influential set of experiments, participants who ate beef subsequently rated cows as having noticeably less capacity to think or feel than participants who had just eaten a plant-based snack instead, even though nothing about the actual cow had changed between the two groups. Later research extended that finding further, showing the effect grows stronger specifically when the connection between the animal and the meal feels more personal or immediate rather than abstract, which strongly implies that the specific format in which a person actually encounters a piece of meat, recognizable or unrecognizable, whole or fully disassembled, is not a trivial detail, but a meaningful variable shaping how much empathy that meat is able to interrupt. The mind, according to this research, is not simply choosing to like one animal less than another based on cuteness alone. It is actively, measurably discounting an animal's inner life, specifically in situations where acknowledging that inner life would create real discomfort about eating it. That directionality is the genuinely counterintuitive part of the research, and it is worth restating plainly because it inverts the assumption most people bring to this topic without thinking about it. The common intuition is that people avoid eating animals they already perceive as intelligent or emotionally complex. The controlled experimental evidence points the other way just as strongly that the act of eating, or even simply deciding an animal belongs in the food category, actively lowers how much mind that animal gets credited with afterward. Perceived intelligence is not a fixed input that determines the outcome. It behaves, in these studies, more like an output that shifts depending on which side of the plate the animal has already landed on. Once a species gets culturally sorted into the food category, whether for genuinely rational reasons or for reasons as arbitrary as an accident of legislative timing and a debunked medieval myth, that sorting itself starts actively suppressing the empathy that might otherwise have complicated it. That mechanism helps explain something the regulatory story alone cannot: why chicken avoided the same fate rabbit did, despite chicken being, by most efficiency measures, a considerably less impressive animal to farm pound for pound. Chicken achieved something rabbit never did at scale in America or Britain: complete industrial distance between the living animal and the product on the shelf. A shrink-wrapped, boneless, uniformly shaped chicken breast bears almost no visual resemblance to a living bird, arriving already stripped of the physical cues, the head, the recognizable body shape, that might otherwise prompt exactly the kind of mind attribution the research describes. Rabbit, lacking the same nationwide industrial processing infrastructure discussed earlier, more often reached consumers in forms that still visibly resembled the animal itself, whole or minimally processed, precisely because no large-scale system ever emerged to disassemble and repackage it the way chicken was disassembled and repackaged. Less industrial distance meant less psychological distance, which meant the mind denial mechanism researchers have documented had far less room to operate. The regulatory gap and the psychological finding are not two separate explanations running in parallel. They plausibly reinforce each other directly. The same missing infrastructure that kept rabbit off supermarket shelves also kept it looking, on the rare occasions it did appear, too much like what it actually was. Chicken's transformation into something visually disconnected from its living source did not happen by accident either. It required decades of dedicated industrial investment, specialized processing equipment, standardized cut classifications, and marketing built around cheerful, sanitized branding, all of it funded and sustained precisely because chicken sat inside the mandatory federal inspection system that guaranteed it a stable, scalable path to market from the very beginning. Rabbit, denied that same guaranteed path, never attracted the kind of large-scale capital investment needed to build an equivalent processing and marketing apparatus. The psychological distancing effect chicken enjoys is not some inherent property of the animal itself. It is a manufactured outcome of decades of infrastructure investment that rabbit's regulatory status made considerably less attractive to fund in the first place. None of this is purely historical at this point either. Interest in small-scale, sustainable, locally raised meat has grown substantially among American consumers in recent years, and rabbit keeps surfacing in exactly that conversation, precisely because its efficiency case remains genuinely compelling on paper. Small farmers trying to meet that renewed interest run directly into the same regulatory friction described earlier: a voluntary inspection system that adds real cost and real complexity compared to raising chickens on the same piece of land. Every farmer's market vendor currently selling rabbit by special order rather than through a normal retail channel is, in a very real sense, working around a gap in federal law that has existed largely unchanged for decades, one that has far less to do with what Americans are willing to eat than most people currently assume. Food policy researchers and small farm advocacy groups have periodically pushed for Congress to formally extend mandatory federal inspection to rabbit, arguing explicitly that doing so would meaningfully lower the barrier to entry for small producers and give the animal's genuine efficiency advantages an actual chance to compete on a level playing field with chicken. Those proposals have not gained significant legislative traction, largely because rabbit farming remains too small, an industry measured in political and economic weight, to generate the kind of sustained pressure that got chicken its own dedicated federal framework decades ago. It is a genuinely circular problem, one with no obvious exit ramp under the current system. The industry stays small partly because the regulatory path is difficult. And the regulatory path stays difficult partly because the industry has never grown large enough to force a change. So, gathering all of it together, why don't we eat rabbit meat when it is the most efficient? Not because the animal is uniquely lovable in some way, pigs and cows are not. Since research on mind perception suggests that particular explanation gets the causation backward far more often than people realize. Not because of one tidy historical decree about monks and fish, since that specific story turns out to be a documented myth. The more accurate answer is layered and considerably less romantic. A genuine gap in federal meat inspection law that never extended the same mandatory infrastructure to rabbit that it extended to chicken, an industrial distance that consumer psychology quietly rewards in rabbit's absence from that infrastructure quietly denied it, and a set of cultural associations that filled the space that gap left behind, but did not create the gap in the first place. Cartoons and childhood pets are real, and they clearly matter to how individual people feel about this specific animal today. But treating them as the root cause, rather than as a story that grew up inside a legal and industrial vacuum nobody ever filled, gets the sequence of events backward. The feelings came after the infrastructure failed to arrive, not before it. Somewhere between a farm bill nobody remembers voting on and a shrink wrapped chicken breast designed specifically not to look like a chicken, an efficient, lean, genuinely practical source of protein, one that a family could have raised in a backyard hutch on kitchen scraps and clover, quietly lost its place at the American table, not because anyone decided rabbit did not belong there, but because nobody with the authority to build the infrastructure it needed ever got around to it. The animal was never the obstacle. It never really was. The obstacle was a piece of legislation nobody thought to finish, sitting quietly behind every cartoon rabbit, every debunked medieval legend, and every well-meaning chef's failed attempt to put it back on the menu, doing far more of the actual work than any of those more visible, more memorable explanations ever did, quietly outlasting all of them precisely because nobody ever bothered to make it interesting enough to notice.